I have the honor to invite to the stage for the presentation of the indices Professor Rafi Melnick, who is at the Tiomkin School of Economics at the IDC, and also at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the IDC. Professor Melnick is one of the founders of the IDC. He is a previous dean of the Lauder School of Government and also the previous provost. He immigrated from Chile, and he was in a combat unit in the IDC. It's called the 202 Brigade. Well, we have the presentation here, and as acceptable at the Herzliya conferences, we try and present quantitative indices in civil domains so that they will radiate on those discussions that we're going to have as we go along. So this was the team that helped me prepare the indices I'll do so very quickly. Now, national security was something that was actually observed directly. So the methodology that we use are indicators that impact the resilience and are impacted by the resilience. So we haven't got time to talk about the methodology, but there are those who believe in this statistic method. The sample, the model, includes Israel and the OECD countries. We have a panel of countries from 1990 through till today, and the sources are top quality from the Democracy Barometer, which is a new one that we're using for political regime issues that is carried out at the social sciences in the center in Berlin. The methodology is always comparative, and we always want to see how Israel over time watches its resilience either improving or decreasing. And also we can compare ourselves against competitors or other countries that we would like to be equal to. So we have three components. The first one is the economic one. You know, we spoke about lights and shadows, so let's start with the shadows and move into the shadows gradually. So these are the variables, the indicators that are the components of our economic indicator. The numbers are the actual relative weight of each indicator that was actually carried out after a referendum out of a questionnaire that we gave out to various professionals, and that is how we made up the picture. This is the picture of the economic indicator. So what we can see here, now, if the index is going up, it means that the resilience is increasing. So during that immigration wave in the 90s, we can see the increase, and then the detrimental effect on the resilience during the Intifada, and then the recession during 2003, 2008. And we can see what was not actually detrimentally affected in the actual global crisis of 2008, 2009, and then the growth after that. So all in general terms, we can see that it is improving. The question is, how do we appear if we look at the competitors or the other countries that we want to be equalized with? So that, of course, is the average. And we said that we sort of decided 100 would be the United States in 1990, and you can see that Israel was on the left-hand side of that distribution, and we're talking about many years ago. Now we've gone on and advanced very nicely, and we not only closed that gap and analyze how we did so, and we also advanced from the point of view of the ranking. In other words, our macroeconomic variables have increased and improved. This The red line is the resilience of the State of Israel in comparison to a group of countries that we would like to be equivalent with. Euro land is the purple one. In other words, they use the euro currency. So slowly but surely, we have nearly closed that gap with the European countries, also with the average of the OECD. And there was a kind of forceps picture. And because during the crisis, the OECD and the G7 countries deteriorated in their resilience, you can see their decrease, and we continued improving. And as a result of that, the gap was bridged. And over the last few years, when the United States and the European countries are being extricating themselves from that long-term recession and crisis, then you can see what their performance is better than ours over the last years. In the Aharon Institute for the Analysis of the State of Israel, we can see various benchmark countries who are similar to ours. That's the green line, and we can see that that's not very different from the OECD average. Here is our GDP per capita in Israel, which is a very important variable in the economy of the State of Israel. We can see the recession of the Intifada and the high-tech crisis. You can see the deceleration during the financial global crisis and the ongoing increase in growth. But when we look at this very nice trend, we have to take into account that we still find ourselves very distant from where we would like to reach in order to be at an equivalent level in that model that we chose, the sample countries. The problem is, of course, a productivity. A worker, an employee, works per hour. He makes much less than he does per hour in other countries that we want to compare ourselves to. But over time, this gap seems to deepen and increase. So our biggest problem is productivity. The growth over the last years was all embedded and focused and also emanated from the fact that we took additions to our labor force, and we actually more participated in the labor force, and the unemployment went down. So it's a very positive result, but we didn't get any more productivity despite all that. So despite the processes in the additional participation in the workforce, basically all this potential was exhausted. So we see that the growth is now becoming very problematic. So if we don't have a program for the improvement of this productivity, I can't see how we're going to grow over the next years beyond the actual labor force growth, which is a sort of given. As you can see, the unemployment rate is very low. It's no longer reasonable that we'll be able to decrease it more significantly. So in the current accounts, we can see that our balance is pretty good. We're talking about surplus of dollars. Basically, you can say they're problems that rich people suffer from. Now, the most dramatic picture of all in our national resilience is in the public debt. You can see where we are 2003 and where we are today after a period of a decade. In other words, the State of Israel, in contrast to what happened in other countries during the time of crisis, we succeeded in retaining our reasonable deficits while continue to grow, and they enabled us to bring down our public debt relative to the actual GDP. And I think that in Maastricht, they really said that we're really the only ones who are keeping to what the demands were and the requirements of Maastricht were. So here you can see the bridging of the gap of the economic dimension, and now we can find ourselves in those sort of a 19th position. We've improved. We're above Spain, the Czech Republic, and Finland, which is quite a good position to be in with the closing of a gap, but we can still go better and do more. Now let us move over to the economic and social index. And I'd like to take the various components and add the social components to them. In other words, we talk about the poverty ratio and the inequality in the sharing of the burden. And if we're talking about unemployment, chronic unemployment, which happens in certain population groups all over the world, and also the actual rate of employment, which was a problematic factor in the past because some of the actual parts of our population didn't participate in the labor force. The picture that emanates from here is very similar from the point of view of the steps, but actually, relatively speaking, our social performance is less positive. Here you can see our basic line on the left-hand side of the distribution. We've advanced somewhat on the social economic side, but we still have not bridged those gaps, as has happened with the economic net factor. So in other words, if you add those social factors, we still find ourselves lagging behind. So here you can see the red line. We can still find ourselves very remote from the Euro land, very different from the average of the OECD, and therefore the problems are very tough ones that really are very burdensome and troublesome to the Israeli society. And tomorrow this will be expanded on, and you can see the macroeconomic performance and what happens in the micro level and in social issues. It'll be expanded on tomorrow. That perhaps is the toughest and the most difficult problem because we still have major poverty. You can see the ratio of the families that are actually suffering before the government actually starts with its subsidies and transfer sums of money from the government. So there is some kind of improvement, significantly not significant, but we can see over the last few years this trend has been curbed, and perhaps the poverty hasn't increased, but we are not improving at the same rate that we were improving in the years before that. From the point of view of the poverty index, we are the most poor in the sample that we said, and that is very burdensome to us, very worrying to us. So that is part of our resilience, and unfortunately we haven't closed that gap yet. From the point of view of the inequality, we can actually see that there has been an improvement in the last 2 years, but this has actually again been sort of curbed, and we need to focus very directly on these issues so that our social resilience will improve alongside the economic resilience. There's improvement. From the point of view of the inequality, we can see ourselves on the right-hand side of the distribution, a very unequal country if you talk about that sample. Vis-a-vis the chronic unemployment in Israel, Israel does not have such a problem. We don't have a group in the population that is chronically unemployed, and it has gone down, the unemployment levels, and that is actually a strong point in Israeli economy. We're at a very low point as compared, as you can see, we're on the left-hand side. The rate of employment, that I think is a variable that is most dramatic from 1993, when we started with our new economic policy. Whole groups of population joined the labor force. We're talking about the Haredi, Orthodox ones, and the Arabs who participated less beforehand. And that is a very positive picture and very dramatic. But as said, the actual skills of these two groups are actually somewhat restricted. They're joining a very ultra-modern society, and their possibility to be able to contribute to the productivity is actually limited, and therefore their capability of actually being a substantial force here, unfortunately, it hasn't happened. And we've really exhausted the potential of it, and we won't be able, just by adding more employment, it won't help. We need to see the improvement in the productivity as well. The employment rate has increased. We've already reached European dimensions, which is a very positive outcome. You can see the economic social dimension gap has not been bridged. We've still got a lot ahead of us that we need to actually work on. And it hasn't actually been being bridged, actually, because in the OECD countries who are starting to slowly leave their crisis behind, that they actually found themselves embedded in 2008, 2009. And therefore, to continue bridging that gap, we do need better performance than we did present here. In this index, we're actually in our 20th position from that point of view. In my last minute that is left, I would like to come and present something that we presented in the past, and that is our governmental political index. We have been using a new kind of database that the center in Germany, they really collect all these components. We're talking about the individual liberties, rule of law, and participation in the public sphere, competition, mutual constraints, governmental capability and competition, and various other issues like that. And we add to that the actual international dimension, because we have various alliances and we have membership in various international organizations and the number of embassies that actually here are in Israel. I'd like to skip that because time is of the essence here, but if anyone would like to see my presentation, then you can see how all these components are quantified by the research center in Germany. And this is the social, the governmental, political dimension. And this is a very concerning, it really arouses our anxiety, because you can see these ups and downs, these fluctuations. And this research study has not been carried out. In 2014, which was the last year that we have data, full data from, we find ourselves at a lower point than we were at the beginning of the sample in 1991. So in other words, in the governmental, political dimension, we have not improved. There were fluctuations up and down, but I would say mainly, I think that really what worries us the most is that over the last years, we find ourselves in a trend of going down and even deteriorating. And perhaps it's a slippery slope. So here, just a few of the indicators. Rule of law, for example, in the state of Israel, that's just one of the indicators, has been going down. The governmental capability, which is our capability of the government to carry out and implement plans, the governance of the government is also on a slippery slope. It's going down. And the participation in various political processes also going down. So all these components bring us to nearly one before the bottom of the rank here position. In other words, just above Turkey in the political base in 1990. And when we look at where we are in 2014, then we've moved up one spot, not because we improved, but because Greece deteriorated, as we know. They are undergoing a very difficult process. So if you note that in comparison to other countries, yes, the various processes are gradual. You cannot expect revolutions in one fell swoop, but in all the sample countries, you can see over time an improvement until the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, but not with us. You can see that the gap is being deepened between us and those states that we want to compare ourselves and be similar to. But if we look at the indicator countries, then the gap is even greater because the political regime there is in an excellent condition. So here we find ourselves in our sample group. We're in position number 25, regime issue, which is very problematic because all the processes and all the variables that can quantify and thus describe our political situation are not increasing, but they're rather in a stagnant state of sort of a freeze or even going down. So lights and shadows. We have light in our macroeconomic position. We've got half of a shadow, half of our light in our economic social situation, but a shadow, a tough, difficult shadow in our governmental political index. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Professor Rafi Melnick for these Herzliya indices. Once a year, we always await this part, and you've not failed us, Rafi.